Europe is the second largest importer of Russian gas after China. Just for anyone who didn't get that, Europe is paying more money, has paid more money since the beginning of the war, over 260 billion euros, to the Kremlin's war coffers, which is far more than is donated to Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm the Spectator's U.S. Deputy Editor, Kate Andrews, and I'm joined by the Spectator's Associate Editor, Owen Matthews, and Sergey Radchenko, who is Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies professor and a visiting professor at Cardiff University. We're here today to talk about the latest Spectator cover out this week, Putin's Trap, written by the one and only Owen Matthews, who's joining us now. Owen, you write in the cover this week that despite all the smiles in Washington, D.C., despite huge boasts of advancement in Donald Trump's talks with Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky of Ukraine, that underneath all of those smiles, Putin has actually laid a trap. Tell us about it.
Right. So let's start with the positive before I get accused of naysaying and ridiculing Trump. It's really important to remember that for all of the horrible things I'm about to say, we are closer to peace this week than we were last week. So the process has started. So let's not forget that. And the man who started it was Trump. And one of the most extraordinary things was that we saw in the White House on Monday was the spectacle of all the European leaders congratulating Trump on reaching out to Putin, who they themselves had completely refused to speak to and treated as a pariah for 3 years. So already Trump has completely sort of shifted the parameters of the debate. It's also true that the atmospherics in the room were excellent, and the meeting between Zelensky and Trump went better than the last time. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine how it could have gone worse, but anyway, it definitely went better. So the problem with the whole positive atmospherics is that the reason they were positive is that none of the substantial issues to which Zelensky is likely to say absolutely no way were discussed on Monday. And this is the nature of the trap of which I write in my story, is that actually what Putin is doing or is attempting to do is convince Trump that he is the reasonable one, that he's the one that's continuing talks, that the door is open, that he's negotiating, and it's Zelensky that is refusing to make peace. But actually, on the other hand, I was just speaking to Gideon Rachman. He pointed out that in fact the precise opposite is happening on the part of the Europeans. The Europeans are trying to pull the blanket in their direction and convince Trump that no, we're the ones that are being reasonable. Zelensky is being reasonable. It's Putin that's on derailing us. So in many ways, what we're seeing right now is a sort of tug of war for the ear and attention of Donald Trump.
Sergey, what have you made of the meetings in Alaska and the meetings in Washington, D.C.? Is there reason to be optimistic, or do you agree with Owen that ultimately, whilst attitudes have shifted and improved, we're not that much closer to actually getting a peace deal?
Not that much closer to getting a peace deal. We're maybe a little bit closer. I would also like to highlight one element, silver lining, if you would, and that is that we are in a better position in terms of a dialogue between Russia and the United States, and these are two nuclear armed powers, and I've always thought that it's important to have a dialogue between them of some kind, not necessarily selling out Ukraine. That perhaps not that's not the kind of dialogue that I had in mind, but generally speaking to each other, maintaining a constant channel of communication. I mean, that is a good and responsible thing to do. And if you compare where we are today with, say, where we were in the fall of 2022, that is the time of the so-called nuclear scare, we're definitely in a better place. Nobody's expecting a nuclear war to break out in Europe anytime soon, and that was something that everybody was worried about back a couple of years ago, if you recall. That being said, no great progress was achieved in these two summits, except, of course, for the element that Putin received his moment of glory. He had his moment of glory in Anchorage, and that's a win for Russia. No matter how you spin it, this is being beamed to the Russian domestic audiences as a vindication of Putin's effort. Look, the Russians are saying, you have tried to isolate us, you have tried to shun us for 3.5 years, and here we are. We're back on the international stage, and you, the Europeans, are not even allowed into the room, right? So that part of the Alaska summit was a clear win for Putin. Beyond that, beyond the atmospherics, I don't see major concessions being made by any one side in what followed in Alaska or indeed in Washington. Now, Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff, as Owen writes in his excellent essay, did try to spin security guarantees as a concession from Putin. I don't see this as a concession from Putin at all. It is more of a nothing burger because, of course, once you get into details about what those security guarantees or what Russia has accepted, we don't know what they have accepted. But from at least from Foreign Minister Lavrov's comments, we can see that they don't want to have any troops on the ground in Ukraine. Security guarantees that are just paper guarantees without any troops on the ground, and that may actually allow Russia to exercise the right of veto, are not security guarantees. So if Russia accepted anything, it's not anything different from what they already were willing to entertain back in the Istanbul talks with the Ukrainians back in 2022. It's not a very good deal for Ukraine, put it this way. But another thing that is interesting is, of course, where Trump stands on all the security guarantees. Because for a moment in Washington, it seemed like Trump would say something like, yes, America is more willing, more interested in offering security guarantees to Ukraine. And that is, of course, what the Europeans want to hear. I don't think he's realistically considering security guarantees, Article 5 style security guarantees for Ukraine. I have not seen anything that would indicate that Trump has really changed his mind on this subject. And so, for that reason, yes, it's mainly atmospheric and very few practical results.
Oh, and what's so interesting about this timeline is that it wasn't that long ago that Donald Trump was getting increasingly frustrated with Putin for what he thought were decent conversations that the two sides were having over the phone between America and Russia. And then he says Putin would go and bomb a civilian site in Ukraine. And it's thought that part of the reason that Putin did end up meeting Trump in person in Alaska was perhaps to set this trap that you lay out to try to appear more reasonable. Do you think it's possible, however, that as the weeks and months continue on, Putin will continue to reveal that he isn't really prepared to make the compromises that he's suggesting he might make? He's not prepared to be reasonable in the way he suggested to Donald Trump that he might be reasonable, because it feels like they've already gone through this process once recently. Perhaps Trump will be more attuned to the difference between Putin's rhetoric in front of him and then his actions behind the scenes.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things is two really interesting things about the Anchorage summit, because they're so far, the only thing we've heard out of the mouth of Putin were specifically those 12 minutes where he actually discussed, where he spoke at the conference. And I would love eventually in the future to meet the writers' room in the Kremlin of guys who choreographed these talking points and choreographed the meeting. I mean, it was an absolute masterclass in blowing smoke up Donald Trump. I mean, he had literally hit every single note. It was like a sort of virtuoso piano performance, Russia hoax, da-dum. The whole, the war wouldn't have started if you were president. You didn't lose the election. Or the heroic Soviet and American soldiers I stopped off at Magadan to lay flowers at the U.S. troops' grave that helped the Soviet Union defeat the Nazis. I mean, everything about that speech was extraordinarily well crafted. Which is to say, to answer your question, or the first part of your question, I think Putin is kind of taken on board that he has to manage Trump very carefully. And here we need to separate out two strands. Is Putin actually making concessions, and Putin convincing Trump that he's being reasonable? Now, those are not the same. Those are not identical things. So the second really important piece of framing that Putin successfully accomplished in Anchorage was to present the Ukraine problem not really as a footnote, but definitely like as only one moving part of a gigantic reset between the US and Russia. And that reset includes all kinds of like sort of big boy superpower things, like sort of space cooperation, like nuclear arms control treaties, which have been allowed to lapse, like exploiting the in mineral reserves, oil reserves under the Arctic. All of this sort of package of stuff, which Trump sort of came in like a salesman. And the one word that he used, the one multi-syllable word that Putin uses three times in his comments in Anchorage was businesslike. Like деловые, he says like деловые отношения. And so he's emphasizing he thinks that he can play Trump by talking about the financial upside, and maybe he's not wrong. So I think Putin's strategy seems to be to widen the discussion beyond actually what the nuts and bolts of Ukraine and start talking about other kind of things that he hopes will keep Trump on board. Because as I say, as a thesis of my piece is, I don't think he actually really cares particularly what the Europeans say. What he cares about is securing US support to roll over the Ukrainians, to make them do what Putin wants.
Right. Sergey, Owen points out in his piece that the American negotiators don't have a lot of experience with Russia. There aren't many Russian experts in that mix. How is that affecting the way that these negotiations are going?
Yes, I noticed that element in Owen's piece, and I think it's spot on. We also had that tweet from Trump on Truth Social a few days ago. I don't know if you've seen it, where he says, "I don't need to take advice from anyone. I know what I'm doing." So, I mean, that's typical. That's classic Trump, right? This idea that the so-called experts, they're all elites. They don't know what they're doing. And he's got the gut feeling and he'll be able to deliver it. Well, obviously the results will tell the story. We don't have the results yet, so as experts we can sit back here and say, "Ha, we told you so," because you don't know the difference between Kherson and Zaporizhia or Donetsk, as we've witnessed from one of Steve Witkoff's comments, or rather his comments in an interview, I think it was, where he was confused about the different regions that are being discussed. To us experts, that kind of looks like incompetence, but the results will speak for themselves. If they're able to deliver, look, I will say, hallelujah, we were wrong. And sometimes it takes, maybe incompetent people to actually deliver a result that everybody wants. Has it happened in history? Yes. Has Trump been ever able to do that? Sometimes I think he has been very lucky with some. That's why he likes to say, "Well, I've resolved 6 wars," whatever that means. But he's got something to his record that I think we have to take seriously. But so far, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has not been resolved, not in 24 hours, not in 24 days. Eventually, it will be resolved. And here I would like to just also agree with Owen that, yes, we are in a position now where we have some form of negotiation, some peace talks that are, I think, leave us in a better position where we were before. But once again, does it matter that you have competent people on the American side, people who know the region, people who speak the languages, people who understand what's going on, the complicated history, the different nuances? Of course it matters, because these are very complex negotiations. And by not having this kind of people in the room, I think the Americans stand to lose out.
Oh, and both you and Sergey have pointed out there that Donald Trump does have something of a record when it comes to pursuing peace. And I might go a step further. I'm sure some of our watchers will disagree. Perhaps it's a controversial point, but I think Donald Trump really wants peace. I think one of the best things you can say about Donald Trump is that when it comes to stopping violence, stopping unnecessary killing, he is the biggest advocate of bringing wars to an end. And this feels like a strange thing to say only 7 months into his second term, but how far down the road is Putin looking? Because Donald Trump is deeply committed to finding peace. Whether or not he can achieve it in this case is a completely different question, but he does seem very committed to the idea. Vice President J.D. Vance, who is thought to be one of the top contenders for the Republican nomination in the next cycle, seems to have very different feelings about this. It's not to say that he doesn't want peace, but it's to say that he has very different attitudes and feelings towards the U.S. involvement in trying to deal with issues in Europe and abroad. Is perhaps Putin thinking, I need to manage the next 3 years with a bit of change and then take the gamble that nobody else is going to care about this in the way that Donald Trump does? Or does he think that he is going to have to come to a head with this before that time is up, simply because Donald Trump won't allow it to go on that long?
That's an excellent question, Kate. I think the bottom line, I think there's an important thing to be added to your statement that Donald Trump really wants peace. He really wants peace. He definitely wants peace, except he's actually not willing to do anything concrete to achieve it that will cost him anything. That's the irony of this war, is that actually Europe and America had a perfect opportunity. I mean, if the West had wanted, we could have shut down this war in 6 months. Easy. How do you do that? Well, you actually properly sanction Russian gas and Russian oil, neither of which was done. And when I hear all of the bravado of the Europeans and how, especially when they're announcing their sanctions packages, I literally like sort of start shouting at my computer screen, because I find their hypocrisy offensive. If I was Ukrainian, I would be furious by these words of solidarity and these sort of fake announcements of 18 sanctions packages. Europe is the second largest importer of Russian gas after China. Just for anyone who didn't get that, Europe is paying more money, has paid more money since the beginning of the war, over 260 billion euros, to the Kremlin's war coffers, which is far more than it's donated to Ukraine. It's the idea that Europe is actually serious about sanctioning Russia is ridiculous. The United States doesn't import any oil from or gas from Russia. It does, by the way, still import a huge amount of uranium from Russia and all kinds of other stuff. But if it was serious, it could start a trade war with India, which supposedly Trump has imposed 25% tariffs, which begin on August 27th. We'll see if that happens on India as sort of supposedly secondary tariffs. He could start a trade war with China. He could have shut all of this could have happened, except with the one tiny thing that would have been very expensive, literally and politically, for the West to do that, because if you shut off the 9.5% of world oil supply that Russia produces, then hey presto, you're paying 3 times more at the gas at the pump. Western inflation goes to the roof. All the Western economies crash. No one wants to pay that price. So yeah, everyone cares about peace, but guess what? Nobody actually wants to do anything that will hurt their pocketbook. Let's just be very clear about that. So what they can offer is like thoughts and prayers, okay, and some arms. Fine, that was not terrible. That indeed helped help Ukraine fight Russia to a standstill, and that was a great achievement and something that no one believed would happen at the beginning of the war. Russia has been halted in its tracks. It's essentially in a war of stalemate with a country that is 10 times smaller than itself. And when I hear Trump say, like, you shouldn't pick a fight with a country 10 times larger than yourself, which is ridiculous in many ways. It wasn't Ukraine that picked the fight. But anyway, you can flip that on its head and say Ukraine defeated a country, or sort of, halted a country that was far more powerful and economically and militarily than it was. So that's not exactly a defeat. But to answer your question, what can Trump do about it? I think I think political will is not nothing. I think his political resources are significant. They're not as significant as the military and economic resources that he's not willing to deploy. But nonetheless, I mean, I think there is a clear sense that this is an end game, and Putin cannot string this out indefinitely. So I don't think we need to be talking about a scenario where Putin is stringing this out into advanced presidency. No, I think this is going to be over, not as fast as Trump says, in a matter of weeks, but certainly in a matter of months. I would say we're in the end game now.
Sergey, as Owen points out in his piece, the biggest consequences of this war continuing on are, of course, for Ukraine. But Zelensky, in many ways, has the fewest options. Were he to make significant compromises, the Ukrainian people and the military probably wouldn't accept it. It's Europe that's in the very tricky position right now because it can make a myriad of choices in a way that actually Ukraine cannot. And the big question is, what does Europe do, especially if Donald Trump starts to ramp this up and starts saying or doing things that Europe, as Owen says there, for years now has made clear red lines for the UK, for France, for Germany, that they are going to back Ukraine as long as Ukraine wants to fight. Is this really coming to a head for Europe now? And are the biggest choices really at the feet of the countries I just mentioned there?
So, okay, that's a great question. The problem with Europe, as ever, is that we're talking about different countries and different policies here. Remember that famous phrase by Henry Kissinger, if I need to speak to Europe, which number do I call? I think we're still in that game now. We had a number of European leaders in Washington, Friedrich Merz, we had Keir Starmer. The UK is not even part of the European Union. We had Macron. But we also had, for example, Alexander Stubb representing, I guess, I don't know, according to Trump, youth, but also the eastern flank, right? I think that's what he was there to represent. So, but there are also other countries. We have Hungary that is emphatically against continuation of war and is constantly threatening to derail European sanctions, such as the weak sanctions that Owen has referred to. The Hungarians have been trying to derail those. Of course, the Hungarians have been buyers of Russian crude, and they're actually recently completely kind of unnoticed by the mainstream media. There was a spat in the last few days between the Hungarians and the Ukrainians over the issue of Ukraine targeting the Druzhba pipeline. And there was a conversation between the Hungarian Foreign Minister Lavrov, presumably over this issue. So you've got countries like that as well. You have countries sort of on the further out in Europe that are not so interested. Spain, for example, there was an issue about raising Spanish military expenditures because, it took some time to convince them that they need to spend 5%. I think they were never convinced that they needed to spend 5% of their GDP on the military and so on. So you've got a variety of perspectives. You have the eastern flank countries that do see the war in Ukraine as existential and are willing to go an extra mile, but who have limited resources. They cannot really do all that much. Then you have countries like, you have France that wants to take the lead in Europe, but nobody wants to follow it. You have Germany that seems to have the capability of taking the lead, but doesn't want to take the lead. And then you have the UK cheerleading from the sidelines. It's so difficult to imagine how Europe will actually bring itself together and develop a consistent, coherent policy with regard to Russia and Ukraine. And indeed, despite this coalition of the willing, all of that talk that we have had over the last few months, nothing concrete has resulted really. The Europeans continue to look over their shoulder to the Americans to see how the Americans will react, what kind of backstop will they provide, what kind of security assurances will the Americans provide. And when the Americans say, look, it's not our problem, sort it out yourselves, the Europeans simply don't seem to be able to bring it together and work out a consistent policy. Am I optimistic that they will? Absolutely not, because Europe was not made for this age of geopolitical rivalry. Europe was made for the age of globalization and trade, and we're in a different game now. It's very, very difficult for the Europeans.
Mm. Let me ask you this. Sergey, I'll ask you first, and then I'll come to you, Owen. In terms of the cover theme of Putin's trap, that trap being that he's going to try to seem incredibly reasonable and willing to compromise while actually giving nothing at all. Which one person is Donald Trump most likely to listen to if they were to whisper into his ear in either direction, saying, yes, Putin is being very reasonable, or actually, Mr. President, he's taking you for a ride? Is he, at the end of the day, most likely to listen to Putin, Zelensky, perhaps Giorgia Meloni in Italy? Is it going to be Macron or Stammer in the UK? Sergey, who do you think actually is closest to the president to lead him in one direction or the other around this trap?
Well, it's been a guessing game, right? Because we have this Trump whisperers in Europe. Some of them claim to be better at it, like Meloni and Alexander Stubb, because he plays golf. But it's very, very difficult to say who really will have any convincing power with him. So I don't know.
Mm. Owen, do you have any guesses?
Yeah, it's Melania. It's definitely Melania is the person that's going to be bending his ear. She's the one that's that was talking to him about the Russian airstrike. She's the one that was that's been talking about the kidnapped Ukrainian kids. I mean, Trump himself says, like, Melania says this and that. So actually, like, I mean, that, which is, sorry, that's a slightly flippant answer, but actually, in terms of world
That's
leaders,
yeah.
to be honest, I actually don't think that. The Trump actually, I kind of agree with Sergey. Actually, I don't really see any of these Trump whisperers actually really having any great influence, because ultimately, the thing we're kind of losing sight of, is that actually I don't think Trump really cares about Ukraine. He doesn't really have a dog in the race. He would like to do it for, I think, for personals, not dishonorable, humanitarian reasons. He wants to stop the killing. I think that's a genuine sort of emotional impulse. He has I think, a sort of vain impulse, a vain sort of agenda to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think he actually kind of might possibly even deserve if he pulls this off. And But in terms of actually, like, what does America have to lose from all of this? I mean, so far America has gained. North America, I mean, the US and Canada have gained an enormous amount economically from the cutting off, from the reduction of Russian gas supplies, because since the beginning of the war they've sold something like $900 million worth of liquefied natural gas to Europe. So they're quids in. On they've Ultimately, I don't think that it's very important. And Kate, you mentioned a moment ago J.D. Vance. Vance is the one that's actually been the senior American politician, the senior sort of MAGA politician that's been most articulate or most expansive about this. And just a few Vance made a very frank and detailed speech. Is that addressed to the Europeans? If you care so much about this war, then, like, fight it yourself. Then it's up to you to fund it, and you need to step up to the plate, because America is out of this business. It's not our problem anymore. And the reason why he's able to say that is because we don't really have a sort of Vietnam style sort of domino theory that's driving U.S. foreign policy about this. No one, I think, in the United States takes seriously the Baltic paranoia that, despite the fact that Putin's taken a year to seize the small town of Pokrovka. Somehow, Helsinki and Warsaw are going to be next, and the Red Army is going to be marching. Poland. I mean, I don't think anyone in the Trump administration takes that seriously. So the short answer is I don't think really Trump cares enough about this, except for personal reasons of wanting to have the credit for stopping a war.
But none of this bodes well for finding his way through the trap. If it's very hard to say who he'll be listening to, if anybody. Owen, you write in your piece, the brutal truth is that for the past 3 years, the Europeans have been lying to Ukraine and themselves. If people have just been bogged down in theories and ideals that they told themselves, how on earth does Trump, does Zelensky, does Europe navigate this trap that Putin has set? I mean, is there a scenario in which you are optimistic that they can get through it?
Yeah, I think that there is a scenario, because I don't think Putin can fight forever. I mean, there's a big sort of debate among sort of Russia experts about the extent to which Putin can afford to dismantle and de-escalate this war, because of a variety of reasons. He has a sort of he'll have to deal with a gigantic army of sort of angry and frustrated veterans, and so on and so forth. I mean, I don't really buy that Putin is going to be in a death car forever. I think he actually, once he can plausibly tick some boxes, I think actually first and foremost see the back of Zelensky. I mean, I think that's sort of psychologically for Putin and the people around him is really important. That they need to see somebody else. I don't think they're going to actually do a deal with Zelensky. I suspect that actually that's going to be one of the things going forward is an insistence on fresh elections in Ukraine. But so I don't think that Putin is in it forever, and I think that but nonetheless he's made it very clear that he's not going to give up before he achieves some kind of ticks some boxes over his agenda of subduing Ukraine or bringing Ukraine or sort of denazifying Ukraine, by which he means getting rid of Zelensky as president, and of neutralizing Ukraine as a threat, by which decoded means Ukrainian neutrality. All the other stuff is details about Russian language rights, but I think Russian language rights is also something, by the way, that the European Union is insisting on, because the Union has strongly criticized Ukraine's language laws and rights of the church. All these there's like a sort of gigantic raft of little details which are all going to be painful for Ukraine, but they are all ultimately in the big picture just sort of boxes to be ticked. I think if Putin can achieve like the big things, which is no Zelensky, no NATO, and some kind of like something to pretend that he has actually sort of denazified Ukraine and made it sort of and somewhat guaranteed the rights of Russian speakers there. I think that's enough for him, and I think he can just pull out. I'd be interested in what Sergey says.
Agree with you 100%. Some tend to think of Putin as a person intent on expanding Russia, I don't know, back into the heart of Europe or taking over the world. There is, of course, a French saying that the appetite comes while eating. But I agree with you that Russia, in reality, has limited capabilities, and it's very clear to me that what Putin is trying to do is try to finish this business in Ukraine on terms that would be favorable to him. He is not necessarily looking beyond that to other places in Europe, to other places around the world, because simply Russia doesn't have the capability to project power that far. But in Ukraine itself, I think it is very important that you highlighted this question of Zelensky's political future and how Putin has tried to get rid of him, or indeed armed with President Trump to get rid of Zelensky. Because for Putin, who thinks like a gangster mob, a gangster boss, right? A mafia boss. He's thinking that Zelensky was the one who stood against him and who therefore needs to be put in his place. He needs to be humiliated so that others draw their lessons from it and not challenge Putin in the future along Russia's so-called periphery, along Russia's so-called sphere of what it sees as its sphere of influence. So it is for that reason that very consistently he has been trying to get rid of Zelensky, which, by the way, makes it very unlikely, to my mind, that we will have a summit between Putin and Zelensky on the kind of terms that would be acceptable to Zelensky. But once, suppose that was accomplished, and I don't know if that will be accomplished. I think it would be a terrible thing for Ukraine. But suppose Zelensky was somehow overthrown through Putin's actions, and somebody more pliable came to power in Ukraine. Would Putin be satisfied? Would Putin be satisfied with a leader like Yanukovych? Quite possibly, of course he would be. The problem is, would the Ukrainian people accept a leader like Yanukovych? How would that play out? That's a very, very different question. As for some of the other so-called conditions that Putin has imposed, including the language rights, making Russian the official language or one of the two official languages of Ukraine, the rights of the church, and so on and so forth. I imagine Trump thinks that those are really minor things. Ultimately, this again comes down to the Ukrainian public opinion and how to sell that to the Ukrainian people. That, obviously this represents massive interference with the Ukraine's internal affairs. That is why when this issue came up at Istanbul in 2022, the Ukrainians refused to accept it, right? It was one of the things they refused to accept. The Russians were trying to impose it. They have been trying to impose it already for 3 years running. But that said, I agree with Owen that that Putin's aims are probably limited, and there's a scenario where Putin will say, "Okay, I have attained some of the, I've met some of the objectives that I can set myself, and I can sell this to the Russian people." I mean, practically, he can sell anything to the Russian people, but he will feel that his legacy in history has been assured. The real question is, are the Ukrainians willing to let him do that? And are the Europeans willing to let him do that? And that's a question that I don't have an answer for.
Mm. Well, for subscribers, this week's magazine will be landing on your doorstep in the next day or two, which includes Owen's excellent cover. For non subscribers, this is your chance, your sign to click the link below and sign up. And in the meantime, you can pick up the magazine on newsstands. Owen and Sergey, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.